Hello everyone. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you love BL, ABO, and emotional romance adventures, be sure to follow our Patreon community for exclusive stories, bonus episodes, and early access to new releases. Orlando Viral was delivered to the Alpha Empire in a white carriage sealed with his father's crest. Not as a son, not as an heir, and not even as a guest, but as the price of peace. The treaty had already been signed before his carriage crossed the eastern gate of Kalis Palace. 1 Omega husband in exchange for 120 years without war. That was the number written in gold ink on the parchment, and that was the value Lord Orson Viral had placed on his youngest son. The palace courtyard was packed with alpha nobles, military officers, consorts, attendants, and foreign witnesses who had come to see what kind of Omega could stop a century of bloodshed. Most of them looked disappointed the moment Orlando stepped down from the carriage. He was slender, pale from the long journey, dressed in formal ivory silk with gloves covering both hands and a silver veil pinned to his dark hair. He lowered his eyes exactly as he had been taught. He moved slowly, carefully, like a fragile noble Omega who feared the weight of every stare around him. A murmur passed through the crowd. So that is the peace offering? He looks breakable. His father must have been desperate. Orlando heard every word and kept his face calm. He had survived worse voices than theirs. He had been called tool, weapon, mistake, pretty bait, and dead boy walking long before these pampered nobles learned his name. Their contempt did not wound him. It helped him. At the top of the palace steps stood Alpha King Parker Kalis, ruler of the Kalis Empire and the strongest Alpha born in 3 generations. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in black military formal wear instead of ceremonial robes. His presence pressed across the courtyard even before he released any pheromone, and the younger alphas near the steps instinctively straightened their backs when he moved. Orlando lifted his eyes only once. Parker was not smiling. That was expected. This marriage was a treaty, not a romance. No king wanted a stranger placed beside him by an enemy house, especially an Omega whose father had spent years funding border rebellions against him. Orlando expected coldness, suspicion, maybe even public humiliation to remind everyone that he was owned now. Instead, Parker walked down the steps himself. The courtyard went quiet. He stopped in front of Orlando and offered his hand, palm upward, not gripping, not commanding, not dragging. Orlando stared at that hand for half a second too long before placing his gloved fingers over it. Parker noticed the hesitation but said nothing. "Welcome to Kalis Palace, Orlando Viral," he said in a steady voice that carried clearly across the courtyard. "From today forward, no one in this empire will insult you as a hostage, a tribute, or a bargaining piece. You are my royal consort, and you will be treated with the honor that title demands." That single sentence cut through the crowd harder than any threat. Some nobles bowed immediately. Others lowered their heads a little too late. Orlando felt the shift and understood Parker's move at once. The Alpha King had not defended him out of affection. He had protected the dignity of the treaty, the stability of the court, and his own authority. Still, it was a good move. Orlando allowed his lashes to tremble. He let his shoulders loosen as if relieved. He played the grateful Omega well enough that several ladies in the front row softened. "Thank you, Your Majesty," he said quietly. Parker's gaze rested on him for a moment. "You do not need to call me that in private." Orlando lowered his head. "Then I will try to remember, my king." The corner of Parker's mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile, and then he guided Orlando inside. Phoenix Arden, Parker's personal guard and oldest battlefield companion, walked several paces behind them. He had sharp gray eyes, a scar along his jaw, and the relaxed posture of a man who could kill before most people finished reaching for a blade. Orlando marked him immediately as dangerous. Not because Phoenix looked strong, but because he looked patient. Inside the palace, the marriage ceremony was short, formal, and mercifully clean. There was no forced bite, no public bonding, no crude alpha display meant to prove Parker had claimed his Omega. They exchanged rings, signed the treaty, drank from the same cup, and stood side by side while the court chanted its approval. Orlando waited for the next part. The private chamber. The closed door. The Alpha alone with the Omega bought to secure peace. His body did not tense. He had trained that reaction out of himself years ago. His breathing remained soft, his eyes lowered, his fingers still. He looked like a nervous bride led toward his marriage bed. Parker walked him to the royal wing after the final witness withdrew. 2 attendants opened a pair of carved doors, then left at Parker's command. The chamber beyond was large, warm, and prepared for 2 people, but Parker did not move toward the bed. He removed his gloves and placed them on the table. "You will sleep here," Parker said. "I will use the adjoining room until you decide otherwise." Orlando looked up despite himself. Parker continued before he could answer. "This marriage was forced on both of us by politics. I will not make it worse by forcing anything else." For a moment, Orlando forgot the expression he was supposed to wear. Parker noticed that too. "You may keep your own attendants if you brought any," Parker said. "If not, choose from the palace staff tomorrow. You may write letters, request books, walk the inner gardens, and ask Phoenix for an escort if you want to leave the royal wing. The outer military grounds are restricted for now." Orlando let his fingers curl lightly against his sleeve. "Am I a prisoner?" "No," Parker said. "But you are valuable and half the court is curious while the other half is offended. Until I know which side is more dangerous, I would rather not give either side an easy chance." That answer was practical, not sweet, and Orlando trusted it more because of that. He bowed his head. "You are generous." "I am careful," Parker corrected. Orlando gave a small, obedient nod, but his mind was already moving. Inner gardens, royal wing, restricted military grounds, Phoenix as escort, half the court offended. Useful. Very useful. Parker studied him for another second, then turned toward the adjoining door. "Rest tonight. The welcome banquet begins tomorrow evening, and you will need patience more than strength." Orlando almost laughed at that, but he lowered his eyes before the impulse reached his mouth. "I understand." Parker paused at the door. "One more thing." Orlando looked at him. "If anyone releases alpha pheromone near you without permission, tell me." The room went still. That was not a casual warning. In an alpha court, pheromone pressure was a weapon disguised as instinct. A weak Omega could be made to kneel, shake, submit, or enter distress before anyone drew a blade. Orlando had been trained to endure it until his lungs burned and his bones felt hollow, but Parker was not supposed to know that. So Orlando gave him the answer everyone expected from a sheltered Omega. "I will, my king." Parker accepted it and left. Only when the adjoining door closed did Orlando let the softness drain from his face. He stood motionless for several breaths, listening. One guard outside the main door, one in the hallway corner, two beyond the balcony. Phoenix's footsteps stopped 3 doors away, then continued. Orlando waited until the rhythm of the wing settled into night duty before he moved. He crossed to the mirror and removed the silver veil from his hair. Then he pulled off his gloves. The hands beneath did not belong to a delicate consort. The palms were marked with old calluses. The knuckles carried faint scars. A thin line cut across his left wrist where a training blade had once gone too deep. Orlando flexed his fingers, feeling the stiffness from hours of pretending to be harmless. He opened the wardrobe and checked behind the lining. Empty. He checked the bed frame, the underside of the writing desk, the hollow space beneath the window bench, and the seams in the wall paneling. Nothing obvious. Parker's chamber security was better than his father's spies had promised. Good. That made the palace worth respecting. Orlando changed into a plain sleeping robe, then took a hairpin from the dressing table. To anyone else, it was a silver ornament shaped like a small branch. In his hand, it became a lockpick. The west wall had a narrow decorative panel carved with old imperial vines. He had noticed the dust pattern earlier when Parker spoke. The panel had been opened recently, but not by servants cleaning the room. The scrape marks were too low, too careful. Orlando worked the hidden catch for less than 20 seconds before the panel loosened. Behind it was not a passage, but a small compartment. Inside lay a torn black ribbon, a dry bloodstain on the wood, and a folded piece of paper with no seal. Orlando picked up the paper and read the single line written inside. "The 7th Omega has entered the palace." His eyes sharpened. Someone in Kalis Palace knew what he was. Someone had arrived before him. And if the message was waiting here, then Orlando had not been sent into the Alpha King's palace as the hunter. He had been sent in as bait. The next morning, Orlando returned the folded message to the hidden compartment and sealed the wall panel exactly as he had found it. He did not destroy the paper, because a trap was more useful when the enemy believed it had not been discovered. If someone inside Kalis Palace knew about the Crimson Institute, then rushing would only expose him faster, and Orlando had not survived 12 years of training by reacting like a frightened boy with a knife in his sleeve. At breakfast, he became the quiet royal consort again. Parker sat across from him at a long table set for 2, reviewing military reports while the servants arranged fruit, bread, tea, and a bowl of warm medicine that smelled bitter enough to punish the sick. Orlando noticed that Parker did not let any servant place a cup directly in front of him without tasting it first. The Alpha King was careful with everything, including kindness. "You did not sleep well," Parker said without looking up from the report. Orlando lifted the teacup with both hands and gave him a faint smile. "New rooms are difficult. That is a polite way to say the palace feels hostile. I would not insult your palace on my second morning. You may insult it on the third, then." Orlando nearly smiled for real, but he lowered his gaze before Parker could catch it. He had expected a hard man, a conqueror, an alpha who measured obedience by silence. Yet Parker spoke to him with dry patience and never pushed when Orlando did not answer directly. That made him dangerous in a different way. Cruel alphas were simple. Gentle ones were harder to read. Phoenix entered after the meal with a stack of sealed letters and a short report about the evening banquet. He nodded respectfully to Orlando, though his eyes lingered for half a breath on Orlando's hands. Orlando had covered them with fresh gloves, but Phoenix was not the sort of man who forgot details. "The Eastern delegation arrived at dawn," Phoenix said. "The Merchant Guild sent gifts. The Southern nobles sent excuses. Lord Markin sent his daughter to observe court etiquette." Parker exhaled through his nose. "Lord Markin sends his daughter when he wants a spy with better manners." Phoenix gave a small shrug. "Lady Selene Markin is 24, politically trained, engaged twice, married never, and clever enough to pretend she is only decorative." Orlando stored the name immediately. Selene Markin. Noblewoman. Spy. Possible threat. Parker turned to him. "You will meet many people tonight. Some will flatter you, some will test you, and some will hope you embarrass yourself. You do not need to impress anyone." Orlando folded his hands in his lap. "What do I need to do? Stand beside me, eat what you can, refuse what you do not trust, and leave when you are tired." That answer should not have affected him. It did. At the Crimson Institute, exhaustion had been called weakness. Pain had been called discipline. Fear had been called failure. No one had ever told Orlando that he could leave a room simply because it had become too much. He kept his expression soft. "I will try not to shame the Empire." Parker's eyes sharpened slightly. "You are not responsible for the Empire's pride." Phoenix looked away as if that sentence revealed more than Parker intended. The banquet began after sunset. Orlando stood beside Parker in the central hall while nobles approached in waves, each one wrapped in perfume, politics, and controlled pheromone. Their greetings were formal, but their eyes were not. They searched his face, his neck, his wrists, his waist, measuring him as if the shape of his body could reveal whether he was worthy of the throne beside Parker. Lady Selene Markin arrived in emerald silk, graceful and smiling, with the calm confidence of someone trained to insult without leaving marks. She bowed to Parker, then turned to Orlando. "Your Highness," she said warmly, "the court is relieved to see you so well. We had heard the journey from Viral Lands was hard on your health." Orlando recognized the blade beneath the silk. "Weak body, weak blood, weak position," he answered with a mild smile. "The journey was long, but His Majesty has been considerate." Selene's gaze flicked between them. "How fortunate. An Alpha King with restraint is a rare blessing." Several nobles nearby went still, waiting to see whether Parker would react. Orlando understood the game. If Parker defended him too sharply, he would look possessive. If he stayed silent, Orlando would look abandoned. So Orlando moved first. "Restraint is only rare among alphas who confuse force with authority," he said gently. "I am fortunate His Majesty knows the difference." The silence that followed was brief, but satisfying. Parker glanced at Orlando, and this time his mouth almost curved. Selene recovered quickly, laughed softly, and stepped aside, but Orlando knew she had marked him as more than a decorative consort. That was fine. Let one clever woman notice his tongue, as long as no one noticed his hands. The first attack came before the main course. A servant in palace gray approached Parker with a silver tray carrying wine from the western cellars. His posture was correct, his steps were even, and his eyes stayed lowered, but Orlando saw the tension in the right thumb pressing too hard against the tray's rim. He also caught the faint almond bitter scent beneath the wine, buried under spice and oak. Poison. Not crude. Not fast. Something designed to weaken an alpha's pheromone control before killing him slowly enough to look like fever. Parker reached for the cup. Orlando let his sleeve catch on the edge of the tray and stumbled with perfect timing. The wine spilled across the white tablecloth and shattered on the floor. Several nobles gasped. The servant froze. Parker's hand closed around Orlando's wrist to steady him, careful despite the sudden movement. "I am sorry," Orlando said at once, making his voice tight with embarrassment. "I was careless." "No harm done," Parker said, but his eyes had already shifted to the spilled wine. Phoenix moved before anyone else. He caught the servant by the back of the neck and forced him down without drawing a blade. 2 guards closed the hall doors. The musicians stopped playing. Parker lowered his voice. "Test it." A palace physician named Dr. Elias Thorne, an elderly beta doctor who had served 3 generations of Kalis rulers, hurried forward with a small glass vial and a silver pin. He touched the wine, watched the liquid darken, and went pale. "Black hyacinth," Elias said. "Distilled and masked. Enough to kill an alpha within the hour." The hall erupted. Parker did not release Orlando's wrist immediately. His hand was warm through the glove, firm but not painful. Orlando made himself tremble as if frightened by how close death had come. Parker mistook the motion for shock and gently guided him behind his own body, shielding him from the chaos. That should have amused Orlando. Instead, something in his chest tightened. Phoenix dragged the servant away for questioning, and the banquet collapsed into controlled panic. Nobles whispered. Guards searched the kitchens. Celine watched Orlando from across the hall with narrowed eyes, though even she could not decide whether the spill had been accident, instinct, or something else. Later that night, Parker walked Orlando back to the royal wing himself. "You saw something," Parker said once they were alone in the corridor. Orlando kept his eyes lowered. "I saw the servant move strangely. Most people saw nothing. I was watching because I was nervous." Parker stopped outside Orlando's chamber door. "You saved my life. I ruined your banquet." "You saved my life?" Parker repeated, softer this time, leaving no space for Orlando to hide behind politeness. Orlando looked up then, and for a dangerous moment, the mask between them thinned. Parker's expression held no suspicion, no hunger, no alpha pride wounded by being protected by an Omega. There was only steady recognition, and Orlando did not know what to do with it. So he lied carefully. "I did not want the peace treaty to fail on my second day." Parker accepted the answer, though his eyes said he did not believe it completely. He reached toward Orlando's hair, paused before touching, then lowered his hand. "Rest," he said. "Phoenix will double the guard." Orlando entered his chamber and closed the door before his breathing changed. He waited, listened, then removed his gloves again. His wrist still carried the warmth of Parker's hand. That was unacceptable. Warmth was not useful. Attachment was worse. Orlando crossed the room, opened the hidden wall panel, and checked the compartment. The folded note was gone. In its place lay a small black token stamped with the Crimson Institute's broken crown mark. Beneath it was a fresh message. "Your mission is active. Kill the Alpha King before the 7th moon, or the Institute will kill him for you." Orlando stared at the words until they stopped feeling like ink and started feeling like a blade pressed against his throat. Behind him, in the hallway beyond the locked door, Phoenix's steps paused. Orlando folded the message into his palm. The palace had enemies outside its walls, enemies inside its court, and one enemy standing in the royal consort's room with a poisoner's training, a killer's hands, and a heart that had just made its first mistake. By the 3rd week of Orlando's marriage, the palace had stopped looking at him as a frightened decorative Omega and started looking at him as a question. That was more dangerous. A useless consort could be ignored, but a quiet consort who spilled poisoned wine at the exact moment an Alpha King reached for it could not remain harmless in the court's imagination for long. Parker handled the rumors by refusing to answer them. He continued to seat Orlando beside him during council breakfasts, continued to walk him back to the royal wing after public events, and continued to keep his pheromones sealed so tightly that no Omega in the palace could accuse him of claiming control through instinct. That restraint made the older Alpha nobles uncomfortable, because Parker's power was obvious even when unused, and many of them believed an Alpha King who did not dominate his consort in public was inviting rebellion in private. Orlando noticed every stare and let most of them pass over him. He wore soft colors, spoke little, and kept his gloves on. When a courtier asked whether the palace overwhelmed him, he answered gently. When a general joked that virile Omegas must be trained to faint beautifully, he lowered his eyes before his fingers could tighten. When Phoenix watched him from the edge of the room, Orlando made certain to move like someone who feared weapons instead of someone who counted them. The only problem was Parker. Cruelty was easy to resist, suspicion was easier, but Parker's quiet attention slipped past defenses Orlando had built with blood and discipline. Parker never asked why Orlando knew the smell of black hyacinth. He never questioned why Orlando's body had moved before the poison touched his cup. He only adjusted palace security, changed the kitchen staff, and placed Phoenix closer without turning Orlando into a prisoner. That should have made him safer to kill. Instead, it made Orlando's mission feel heavier each night. The 7th moon deadline moved closer, and the Crimson Institute's token remained hidden beneath a loose floor stone near Orlando's bed. He checked it twice a day, not because he needed the reminder, but because ignoring a command from Crimson had once cost 3 boys their hands and 1 Omega his voice. The Institute did not threaten loudly. It waited, then punished. On the 21st day after the wedding, the palace prepared for the Grand Alliance banquet, a formal gathering of allied lords, rival territories, military families, and neutral trading houses. It was supposed to prove that Parker's marriage had stabilized the empire. It was also the perfect stage for someone to tear that stability apart. Phoenix informed Orlando of the guest list while escorting him through the Eastern Gallery. Eve Draven arrives before sunset, Phoenix said, watching Orlando's face without pretending not to. He rules the Iron Veil March, controls 3 northern fortresses, and has challenged Parker's border authority twice in 5 years. A loyal subject, then, Orlando said. Phoenix's mouth twitched. A dangerous one. He respects strength, hates restraint, and believes Omegas near power make Alphas weak. Then he will dislike me. He already does. That answer was too direct to be courtly. Orlando glanced at him. You speak freely for a guard. I speak carefully for a man trying to keep his king alive. Orlando stopped walking. Phoenix stopped with him. For a moment, the wide gallery held only the low movement of servants in distant corridors and the sharp tension between 2 people who both knew more than they admitted. Phoenix's hand rested near his sword, not touching it. Orlando's hands remained folded, gloved, harmless. You think I am dangerous, Orlando said. I think the palace became more interesting after you arrived. That is not an answer. It is the only answer I can give without accusing the royal consort of anything I cannot prove. Orlando looked at him calmly. Then perhaps you should find proof. Phoenix held his gaze, and something like respect passed between them, thin and reluctant. Before he could reply, a servant hurried around the corner and bowed. Your Highness, His Majesty requests your presence in the Western study. Parker was waiting with Dr. Elias Thorne, the elderly beta physician who had identified the poison at the banquet. A small silver device lay open on the desk, built from glass tubes, black metal, and a central crystal that glowed faintly with stored pheromone residue. This was found in the guest wing prepared for Eve Draven, Parker said. Elias believes it is a pheromone amplifier. Orlando kept his breathing steady. Elias adjusted his spectacles. A crude name for a refined weapon. It collects alpha pheromone, concentrates it, and releases it in a controlled burst. In a crowded hall, it could trigger panic, submission response, or heat distress in sensitive Omegas. Parker's jaw tightened. Could it be used on Orlando? Yes, Elias said. That is almost certainly the point. Orlando looked at the device and understood the strategy at once. Eve would not need to touch him, threaten him, or draw a weapon. He only needed Orlando to collapse in public. If the Empire saw the royal consort reduced to trembling heat before allied rulers, Parker's marriage would become a humiliation, and every noble who already resented the treaty would find a reason to question him. Parker turned to Orlando. You do not have to attend tonight. That was the wrong offer and the right one at the same time. If Orlando stayed away, Eve would win before entering the hall. If Orlando attended and the amplifier worked, Parker's enemies would get exactly what they wanted. Orlando could endure a burst longer than most Omegas, but Crimson training did not make him invincible. It only taught him how to suffer without giving the enemy proof. I will attend, Orlando said. Parker's eyes darkened. This is not a test you need to pass. It is already a test whether I enter the room or not. You are not a shield for my throne. No, Orlando said, meeting his gaze. I am the person your throne is currently being attacked through. The room fell quiet. Parker looked as if he wanted to argue, but the truth left him no clean path. Orlando appreciated that he did not insult either of them with empty comfort. Then stay close to me, Parker said. That may make the court think you are protecting me. I am protecting you. The words struck harder than they should have. Orlando forced his face into calm obedience and lowered his head before Parker could see what they had done. The Grand Alliance banquet began under heavy guard. The hall was filled with ranking alphas, betas, foreign envoys, and consorts dressed in formal colors that showed their houses and loyalties. Parker sat at the high table with Orlando beside him, Phoenix behind his right shoulder, and Elias posted near the physician's archway with 2 assistants carrying emergency suppressants. Eve Draven entered late enough that every person in the hall had to watch him arrive. He was tall, blonde, and broad in the polished way of an alpha raised to believe every room should rearrange itself around him. His formal coat was dark red, his gloves black, and his smile carried the confidence of a man who had already chosen where the wound would land. He bowed to Parker with perfect disrespect. "Your Majesty," Eve said, "I offer congratulations on your marriage, though I confess I expected your consort to be resting. Virile Omegas are not famous for endurance." Parker's expression did not change. Orlando decides where he stands. Eve turned his gaze to Orlando. "Does he? How modern of you." A few nobles laughed under their breath. Orlando lifted his cup but did not drink. "I was told Ironvale men valued courage. I did not realize attendance at dinner counted as a heroic act there." The laughter stopped. Parker looked forward, but Orlando saw the faint movement at the edge of his mouth. Eve saw it too, and his smile sharpened. The first wave of pheromone hit 10 minutes later. It rolled through the hall like invisible pressure, heavy with alpha dominance, sharpened by the amplifier and aimed toward the high table. Several Omega attendants gasped. One noble consort dropped his cup. Another clutched the chair arm as his scent spiked in panic. Orlando felt it slam into his chest. His throat tightened. Heat crawled under his skin. His pulse tried to climb. The old Crimson command snapped into place inside his mind. Breathe through the mouth, loosen the knees, lock the jaw, count the heartbeats, do not show the pain. Parker stood so fast his chair scraped back. His own pheromone surged outward, not uncontrolled, but focused like a drawn blade. The pressure around Orlando eased as Parker's scent cut through Eve's attack and forced the hall into submission. Several alphas lowered their heads instinctively. Eve laughed softly and raised both hands. "Careful, Your Majesty. If your consort cannot sit through a banquet without your pheromone shielding him, the court may wonder whether he is fit to stand beside you at all." There it was. The trap. Parker's eyes turned lethal. "Say the next sentence carefully." Eve stepped into the open space before the high table. "I invoke the trial of the royal consort." The hall froze. Phoenix's hand closed around his sword hilt. Elias went pale. Several elderly nobles exchanged fearful looks, because they recognized the law even if no one had dared use it in decades. Eve continued, voice ringing across the hall. "By imperial statute, if the royal consort is judged too weak to represent the throne, a challenger may demand public trial. If the consort wins, his honor stands. If he loses, the Alpha King must surrender claim over the contested alliance territories. If the king fights in his place, he admits the consort is unfit and forfeits the challenge by law." Parker stepped down from the dais. "You are using dead law to stage a coup. I am using imperial law to test whether your Omega is more than silk wrapped around a treaty." Eve's gaze slid to Orlando. "If I win, Ironvale claims the Eastern Alliance routes, and your pretty consort comes under my authority until the council determines his future placement." The insult was clear. Placement meant ownership. Parker's pheromone cracked through the hall so violently that several glasses shattered. "You will not speak of him as property." Orlando rose before Parker could say more. The movement pulled every eye in the hall. His body still burned from the amplifier. His fingers wanted to shake. His breathing hurt, but none of that mattered. He had been trained to survive pain, trained to kill alphas, trained to obey Crimson, trained to be used by his father, and yet Parker, the man he had been ordered to murder, was the only one in the room furious because someone had called him property. That made Orlando's choice clear enough to terrify him. "I accept," Orlando said. Parker turned sharply. "No." Orlando did not look away from Eve. "But I will amend the terms." Eve smiled. "You are in no position to amend anything." "I am the challenged consort," Orlando said, his voice calm enough to silence the whispers. "The law gives me that right." The older nobles looked at one another again, and one of them reluctantly nodded. Orlando stepped down from the dais. He moved slowly because every step had to look like courage instead of training. He stopped in front of Eve and lifted his chin. "If I lose, you may claim what the law allows," Orlando said. "If I win, Ironvale does not merely withdraw its challenge. Its fortresses, routes, soldiers, and revenues transfer under my direct authority." Eve stared at him, then laughed. "You think you can beat me?" Orlando allowed his frightened consort mask to crack just enough for Eve to see the cold thing beneath it. "I think you brought a weapon to break an Omega," Orlando said. "And now you are wondering why it did not work." The laughter died from Eve's face. Parker said Orlando's name behind him, low and strained, but Orlando could not turn back. Not yet. If he looked at Parker, he might remember that he was supposed to kill him. He might remember that he no longer wanted to. Eve leaned closer and lowered his voice. 5 days from now in the Imperial Arena, I will make your king watch you crawl." Orlando smiled faintly. "Then bring witnesses," he said. "I would hate for Ironvale to deny what happens next." 5 days after the Grand Alliance banquet, the Imperial Arena filled before sunrise. Every noble house in the capital sent witnesses, every military faction sent officers, and every foreign envoy came with scribes ready to record whether Parker Kalis would lose his throne because the Omega beside him could not survive one public trial. Orlando stood in the preparation chamber beneath the arena, listening to the crowd above without moving. The sound was not fearsome. Crowds were only weather. They rose, broke, and vanished when blood gave them something sharper to watch. Phoenix waited near the door with 2 guards, his face unreadable. Parker stood across from Orlando, dressed in black without a crown, because he had refused to wear one while the court waited to decide whether his consort would cost him an empire. "You can still stop this," Parker said. Orlando adjusted the cuff of his plain white sleeve. "No, I cannot. I can surrender the challenged territories. That would make Ironvale stronger. I can challenge Eve afterward and take them back. That would start a civil war. I can survive a civil war." Orlando looked at him then. "Can your people survive one?" Parker did not answer, and that silence was the closest Orlando had come to winning an argument with him. Dr. Elias Thorne stood beside a medical table with emergency suppressants, bandages, and a sealed vial of stabilizer. The old beta physician had argued for armor, sedatives, and 3 layers of guards, none of which the trial allowed. He now looked at Orlando with the grim helplessness of a doctor watching a patient walk toward a blade. "You should at least drink the stabilizer," Elias said. "It will slow my reflexes. It may keep your pheromone system from collapsing if Eve uses another amplifier. If he uses one in the arena, he admits he cannot beat me cleanly." Elias gave Parker a sharp look. "He is very calm for someone walking into death." Orlando almost smiled. "That is because I am not walking into death." Phoenix's gaze narrowed slightly. Parker stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Orlando heard. "Do not prove anything to them at the cost of your life. I am not doing this for them." Then who? Orlando could have lied. He had lied well for years. He could have said the treaty, the throne, the empire, or survival. Instead, he held Parker's gaze a moment longer than was safe. "For the man who was willing to lose a crown rather than let someone own me." Parker's expression shifted, and for a breath, the chamber felt smaller than the arena, smaller than the empire, smaller than the mission waiting like poison between them. Then the horn sounded. Orlando turned before Parker could stop him. The arena gates opened onto a wide circle of sand, marked with black stone lines and surrounded by tiers of witnesses. Eve Draven waited at the center in red combat leathers, armed with a long dueling saber and a short hook blade made to catch, pull, and tear. He had dressed for spectacle, and the court loved him for it. He looked like an alpha who believed victory had arrived before he did. Orlando entered in white. The crowd reacted with confused whispers. No armor. No ceremonial shield. No heavy cloak. Only fitted white training clothes, soft boots, and gloves. Eve laughed loudly enough for the front rows to hear. "Did Parker send you dressed for burial?" Orlando stopped 10 paces away. "No. I chose white so Ironvale will see its defeat clearly." The crowd stirred. Eve's smile thinned. Imperial Judge Mateo Vale, an elderly alpha jurist who presided over ancient trials and hated that this one had been revived, raised his black staff from the viewing platform. "The trial of the royal consort begins under imperial law. No outside interference. No hidden guards. No forced pheromone amplification. Victory is declared by surrender, incapacitation, or death." His staff struck stone. "Begin." Eve moved immediately. He crossed the distance with brutal alpha speed, saber cutting toward Orlando's shoulder in a strike meant to cripple rather than kill. Orlando did not block. He stepped inside the arc, turned his body narrow, and let the blade skim past his sleeve while his gloved fingers struck Eve hard beneath the ribs. The blow was small. The effect was not. Eve's breath caught, and Orlando used that half-second to retreat before the hook blade could catch his arm. The crowd noise changed from amusement to surprise. Eve rolled his shoulder. A parlor trick. He attacked again, faster this time, mixing saber cuts with short hook strikes aimed at Orlando's wrist and throat. Orlando moved lightly, never meeting strength with strength, never staying where an alpha expected prey to freeze. He gave ground, took angles, watched Eve's footwork, and counted the pattern beneath the rage. 3 high cuts, 1 hook feint, a shoulder drop before the killing thrust. Crimson training had called alphas predictable when insulted. Not weak, never weak, predictable. Eve pressed harder, his pheromone leaking into the air despite the judge's warning. Several Omega witnesses recoiled in the lower tiers. Orlando felt the pressure scrape along his nerves, hot and commanding, demanding submission from instincts he had spent 12 years burying. He let one knee dip. The crowd gasped. Eve saw weakness and lunged. Orlando's right hand snapped to his sleeve. A thin hidden blade slid into his palm, legal by trial rules because no weapon had been banned, only outside interference. He pivoted under Eve's thrust and cut across the alpha's inner forearm, deep enough to sever control but not life. Eve roared and dropped the hook blade. The arena erupted. Parker stood at the royal platform, motionless, but his hand had crushed the armrest of his chair. Phoenix stared at Orlando now without any remaining doubt. Eve staggered back, blood running down his fingers. "You little fraud." Orlando removed both gloves and let them fall into the sand. The scars across his hands were visible to everyone. Silence spread through the arena as the court understood at once that those were not the hands of a protected Omega raised for music, embroidery, and court smiles. They were the hands of someone trained until skin split and healed wrong. Eve's face darkened. "What are you?" Orlando drew the second blade from his other sleeve. "The mistake your allies should have warned you about." That was when Eve stopped pretending honor mattered. His pheromone burst outward in a violent wave, raw and concentrated, not from a machine this time but from his own alpha core. Judge Mateo shouted a warning, but the sound drowned beneath the panic of Omegas collapsing in the lower seats. Orlando's vision blurred at the edges. His pulse slammed hard enough to hurt. His body wanted to kneel, not because his mind accepted Eve, but because biology had claws deeper than pride. He bit the inside of his cheek until blood filled his mouth. Pain cleared the blur. Eve charged. Orlando threw the left blade. It struck Eve's wounded forearm and forced the saber wide. Orlando stepped into the opening, pulled a compact black bow from the flat harness hidden against his back, and snapped it open in one practiced motion. The arena fell into stunned disbelief. Eve barely had time to register the weapon before Orlando drew and fired from 5 steps away. The arrow punched through Eve's thigh. He crashed to one knee. Orlando moved behind him, hooked an arm across his throat, and pressed the remaining blade beneath his jaw. Eve froze, breathing hard, blood soaking into the sand. "Yield," Orlando said. Eve spat blood and laughed. "Kill me, then. Show them what kind of Omega Parker married." Orlando's blade pressed deeper, and the crowd held its breath. Killing Eve would be clean. It would end the threat, prove strength, and satisfy the part of him that Crimson had carved into a weapon. But Parker was watching, and so was the Empire. This moment would decide whether Orlando became a monster they feared or a ruler they could not ignore. He leaned close to Eve's ear. "I do not need your corpse to own Ironvale." Then he cut the strap holding Eve's house signet, tore it from his neck, and kicked him face first into the sand. Eve tried to rise. Orlando planted one boot between his shoulders and raised the signet high. "I claim victory under Imperial law." Judge Mateo looked toward the council seats. No noble dared object. The evidence was visible in blood, sand, and silence. "The trial is decided," Mateo announced, voice rough but clear. "Royal Consort Orlando Viral stands victorious. Ironvale's challenged holdings transfer under his authority by accepted terms." For several seconds, no one moved. Then Phoenix dropped to one knee. Not for Parker. For Orlando. The sound of armor followed across the arena as officers, witnesses, and even reluctant nobles bent under the weight of law and spectacle. Orlando stood above Eve with blood on his sleeve, a bow in one hand, and Ironvale's signet in the other. Parker reached him before the official escort could. He stopped close, eyes burning with shock, relief, and something more painful. "Orlando," he said quietly. Orlando looked at him, and the arena noise faded beneath the simple fact that Parker had come to him not as a king claiming a victory, but as a man terrified he had almost watched someone precious die. Then Phoenix entered the ring with a sealed black folder in his hand. His face had gone pale. Your Majesty, Phoenix said. This was found in Eve Draven's private carriage. Parker opened the folder. Orlando saw the broken crown mark before he saw the words. Crimson Institute. Parker read the first page, and all warmth left his face. Subject 7, Orlando Viral. Final assignment. Infiltrate Kalis Palace, secure trust through consort bond, and assassinate Alpha King Parker Kalis before the 7th moon. The arena was still kneeling. Eve laughed weakly from the sand. Parker looked up from the file. Orlando could not move. The victory had lasted less than a minute before the truth drew its blade. And that is where this part ends. Orlando has just won the trial, taken Ironvale's authority into his own hands, and shocked the entire Empire by revealing the strength he had hidden behind the mask of a fragile Omega. But the victory did not last long. The truth has finally reached Parker, and now the Alpha King knows the Omega he was trying to protect was originally sent into his palace with one mission: to gain his trust, get close to his bed, and assassinate him before the 7th moon. So what happens next? Will Parker see Orlando as the enemy his father created? Or will he remember every moment Orlando chose to protect him instead? Was Orlando truly only a weapon from the beginning? Or did something real grow between them inside the palace walls? And if the Crimson Institute has already moved its pieces into the Empire, who else is waiting in the dark? The next part continues as an extra extended bonus on Patreon, where the story goes deeper into the betrayal, the romance, the tension, and the dangerous truth behind Orlando's past. On Patreon, you can watch the continuation early, unlock exclusive stories that are not posted publicly, and enjoy special 18+ and censored versions with stronger ABO tension, darker romance, mature scenes, and emotional moments that cannot be fully shown on regular platforms. Patreon members also get access to bonus episodes, early previews before everyone else, exclusive Manhwa-style stories, extended scenes, and private content made especially for supporters. If you want the full version of what happens after Parker discovers Orlando's mission, the next part is already waiting for you there. Your support on Patreon helps this channel grow, helps more stories like this continue, and allows me to create longer, darker, more emotional, and more uncensored ABO boy love stories for you. Thank you so much for watching, listening, and staying with Orlando and Parker's story. If you enjoyed this part, please like, comment, and subscribe to support the channel. And if you want to continue the story right now, check the Patreon link and unlock the next exclusive part today.